The wedding was fabulous. I stood at the altar, holding hands with the man I loved. Mark was perfect. Tall, confident, successful. The guests applauded as we exchanged vows. I felt like it was the happiest day of my life. But even in this moment of joy, I could feel someone else's heavy gaze on me. My new mother-in-law was Margaret. She sat in the front row, her arms folded across her chest, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't applaud. She didn't smile. She hated me. As Mark and I walked past, she reached out, squeezed his wrist, and looking straight at me, said quietly, "I hope you haven't made the biggest mistake of your life, son." I pretended not to hear, but a cold fear was already building inside me. Later that evening, the banquet was in full swing. I went out onto the balcony to catch my breath for a few minutes. I could hear the music playing inside, the guests laughing, my husband greeting, everyone with champagne in his hand. But suddenly a cold voice came from behind me. "Do you think you won?" I turned. Margaret. She stood with a glass of wine, her gaze sharp as a knife. "Excuse me." I narrowed my eyes. She took a step closer. "Do you think that now that you're his wife, you've become the main woman in his life?" My heart sank, but I forced myself to speak calmly. "I love Mark and he loves me." Margaret grimaced. "Love is temporary, but motherhood is forever." She raised her glass and, without taking her eyes off me, took a slow sip. "I know who you are. The girl is not of our circle." Her eyes flashed coldly. "You have no lineage, no money, no status." I gritted my teeth, but remained silent. "And do you really think you can become part of our family?" I raised my head and answered firmly, "I am already part of this family." Margaret leaned closer and whispered, "Not for long." And without waiting for an answer, she turned and left. I stood there watching her. My mother-in-law hated me. I had known this before the wedding, but I thought I could convince her. I was wrong. This war was just beginning. Life after marriage was supposed to be happy. Mark and I moved into the large family estate that had been in his family for many years. I remember the first time I walked in as his wife. The high ceilings, the marble floors, the ornate chandeliers, everything looked like a palace. But I felt cold. And it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from one person. Margaret. She met us in the living room, her arms folded across her chest. Her gaze showed no warmth. She didn't say welcome. She just looked me up and down and sighed. "Well, congratulations." Her voice was cold. "I hope you understand that this is not your house." I didn't even have time to answer, because Mark gently hugged me and said, "Mom, name of Gigi, and I are now a family." I felt the warmth of his hand on my waist and smiled. But Margaret's gaze was getting darker and darker. "Family?" She repeated the word as if it were something disgusting to her. She slowly turned her eyes to me and added, "Let's see how long." At that moment I realized, I am not wanted here. Life in Margaret's house. Every day became worse. At first, Margaret simply ignored me. She seemed not to notice my existence. She only spoke to Mark. "Oh, son, have you eaten yet? Did you have a good rest? How are things at work?" I was sitting next to her, but I did not exist for her. I endured. I believed I could change her. But then she moved on. The first blows. Margaret began to make me feel like an outsider in my own home. One morning, when I went into the kitchen to make myself some coffee, she was already sitting at the table. She slowly looked up and said, "Oh, you're still here?" I paused. "What do you mean?" She smiled slightly, sipped her coffee and said, "Well, I thought you'd already gone to work. Like a normal wife who wants to help her husband." I gritted my teeth. "I work online." She raised her eyebrows. "Ah, all those jobs on the internet." Her voice dripped with sarcasm. "Mark works from morning till night, and you sit in a big house doing what exactly?" I felt anger boiling inside me. "I make money." She sighed loudly. "Well, yes. At least there is some benefit from you." I didn't answer, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. She tried to humiliate me every day. The poison she spread. At first it was just words, but then she began to manipulate Mark. I saw how he changed. If before he was gentle and caring, now he became cold. I noticed how he tensed up after conversations with his mother. And then one night, while we were having dinner, he suddenly said, "Honey, don't you think you could do more around the house?" I looked up. "What?" He shrugged. Well, Mom says that. I banged my fork on my plate. Mom again. He looked uncomfortable. She's just worried. I felt my anger boil. Margaret was playing a long game. She was slowly poisoning Mark. She was changing his attitude toward me. She wanted him to kick me out, and I could already see him starting to listen to her more than to me. Margaret's night visit. One night, while Mark was in the shower and I was putting things in the closet, Margaret appeared in the doorway. I stopped. Do you need anything? She slowly walked into the room. I just wanted to look at this place. She looked at the furniture, the pillows, my things. You know, I always imagined that another woman would live here. I pursed my lips. Another. She smiled. A woman who suits my son. She took a step closer. Who doesn't ruin his life? I'm sorry, but I tried to remain calm. How exactly am I ruining his life? Margaret sighed as if she were talking to a child. Oh, come on, be honest. She leaned closer. You're not worth it. I clenched my fists. She said it directly. No hints. No fake smiles. Right to his face. I exhaled. You think so? She smiled. And so did Mark. My heart sank. I shook my head. No. He loves me. Margaret smiled slyly. Yes, for now. She put her hand on the doorknob. But he'll understand very soon. She opened the door and took a step into the hallway. Before she left, she turned and whispered that I was right. I was left standing in the dark room. I no longer had any doubts. It was a clear declaration of war. And I knew this was just the beginning. Life in this house was turning into hell. Margaret no longer tried to hide her hatred. Every day she purposefully poisoned my life, and the worst thing is that she changed Mark. My husband, who used to be my support, gradually turned into her puppet. She turned him against me, drop by drop, like a slow poison. And I saw it. But the worst thing is that I could not do anything about it. Margaret's insidious plan. One evening, when we were sitting at dinner, Mark suddenly said, Honey, haven't you thought about finding a normal job? I looked up at him. Sorry, what? He shrugged. Well, you work online. But it's not a serious matter. It took me a few seconds to figure out where this was coming from. I slowly looked over at Margaret. She was sitting across from me, smiling faintly, pretending it didn't concern her. I took a deep breath. Mark, I earn my own money. And that's enough for me. He sighed. It's just that Mom says. Oh, Mom again. I couldn't hold it in. I dropped my fork on my plate and pushed my chair back heavily. Mark, are you and I related, or are you and Mom related? His eyes flared with anger. You shouldn't say that. She's just worried about me. I laughed. Worried? Is she trying to put me down? Margaret finally decided to intervene. Oh, honey, is it really that hard to accept that my son deserves more? I stood up and pushed my chair back. What kind of more is that? A woman you can control. She raised her eyebrows. You're finally starting to understand. I felt the blood rush to my head. Mark, are you seriously letting her talk like that about me? He didn't answer. He just looked down. And I understood. She had already won this round. The prenuptial agreement, a backstabbing stab. The next day, as I was drinking my morning coffee, Mark unexpectedly placed a folder in front of me. What is this? He scratched the back of his head awkwardly. Mom thinks it would be right to sign a prenuptial agreement. I looked up at him sharply. We're already married. He shrugged. It's just a formality. I opened the documents. My hands trembled. In the event of a divorce, the wife will not have any rights to any of the assets. I slowly raised my head. Are you serious? He swallowed. It's just for safety. Whose safety, Mark? I clenched the papers, so hard they almost tore. Is this your idea? Or my mother's? He said nothing. I knew the answer. My lips twitched in an evil smile. She wants me to sign this contract because she's already preparing me for the divorce. He clenched his fingers into a fist. Don't say that. I threw the folder into his lap. I'm not signing anything. He glared at me. Why can't you just do it for me? I smiled. Because it's not for you. It's for her. He couldn't argue. I stood up and walked past him. Before I left the room, I said, Mark, think about the last time you made a decision without her. His silence spoke more to me than any words could. Margaret sees that her plan is working. The next morning I left the house to get some fresh air, and when I returned, I saw Margaret standing by the door waiting for me. I stopped. She crossed her arms and smiled slowly. Oh, what determination! But believe me, dear. She leaned closer. It's only a matter of time. I narrowed my eyes. What? A little more, and my son will throw you out of this house himself. Her words hit me like a punch to the chest, but I didn't show her weakness. I leaned closer and whispered, "This isn't over yet." Margaret fell silent. She expected me to be weak, that I would cry, that I would beg, but she had miscalculated. I was no longer afraid. I was ready to fight. I knew this moment would come. Margaret didn't stop. She pressured Mark every day, poisoned his mind with her words, made him doubt me. But this time she went even further. She prepared the final blow, after which everything was about to fall apart. The morning that changed everything. That day Mark left for work, and I was left home alone. I decided to finally relax a little. I made myself a cup of coffee, turned on my favorite music, and sat down to read. But an hour later the doorbell rang. I opened it. A lawyer. I frowned. "Good afternoon. What's the matter?" He looked at me carefully. "Mrs. Gigi, I've been asked to give you these documents." He handed me a folder. I slowly opened it and my heart sank. Divorce papers. My vision blurred a little. This is some kind of mistake. The lawyer shook his head. "No, this is an official request. The documents need to be signed soon." I didn't understand anything. We didn't fight that seriously, did we? Yes, we had problems. But a divorce? I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down. This my husband's initiative? As far as I know, yes. But I'm just handing over the documents. I barely restrained myself from screaming. I signed the divorce papers, without even hearing it from Mark himself. It was humiliation. It was betrayal. And I knew who was behind it. The conversation that put everything in its place. That evening, when Mark got home, I was waiting for him. I was sitting at the table. His divorce papers were in front of me. He came in, saw the papers, and stopped. "What is this?" I asked quietly. He ran his hand over the back of his head, looking tired and tense. "I don't know what to say." I smiled, but it was a cold smile. "Is that true, Mark? Do you want this?" He clenched his fists. "Mom!" I slammed my fist on the table. "Enough!" He jumped up in surprise. "Enough of that," Mom said. "Say it yourself." I looked into his eyes. I expected him to say, "No, it's a mistake. I didn't mean it. Mom did it for me." But he didn't say anything. And then, he nodded. My world stopped. "Yes," he finally said. "I want this." Something inside me snapped. I stopped fighting. I didn't ask for an explanation. I just slowly signed the papers and threw them in front of him. "If you want it your way, please do." I got up and went to my room. Mark didn't stop me, and I understood. We were over. A secret they didn't know about. I closed the door to my room. My hands were shaking. I opened the bedside table and pulled out another folder of documents. These papers weren't about the divorce. This was my biggest secret. Documents that Margaret and Mark didn't even know about. I ran my fingers slowly over the title page. The purchase and sale agreement. Before the wedding, when I moved in with Mark, I had officially purchased this house. I had done it in advance, using legal loopholes they hadn't even thought of. On paper, this house was mine. Margaret thought she had won the war. She thought I was losing everything. But the truth was more beautiful than any revenge. They were the ones left with nothing. I clutched the folder to my chest and finally laughed. Margaret thought she was in control, that she had thrown me out of my own life. But she had no idea what was really happening. I looked in the mirror. My eyes were calm for the first time. I knew I was ready to make the final move. Margaret wanted to destroy me, but I will destroy her first. She will learn the price of her intrigues. I was no longer a victim. That night, as I lay in bed, holding the title deeds, I felt neither sadness nor anger. I felt excitement. I had been waiting for this moment. Margaret thought she had won. She thought I would leave them this house and my life. But tomorrow she would realize that everything had not gone according to her plan. The morning their world changed. I woke up before anyone else. The sun was just beginning to peek through the windows when I calmly made my way down to the kitchen. Margaret was sitting at the table, sipping her morning coffee. She didn't even look at me when I walked in. "Are you still here?" she asked coldly. I stopped by the table and looked at her without smiling. "Yes, I'm still here." She put down her cup. "I thought you had already packed your things. You have nothing else to do here." I calmly placed the folder of documents in front of her. Margaret narrowed her eyes. "What is this?" I smiled. "These are the documents for this house." She frowned, opened the papers, and began to quickly turn the pages. I saw her lips turn white and her fingers tremble as she realized she was reading. This. She raised her head abruptly. "That's impossible." I crossed my arms over my chest. "Oh, that's possible." Margaret ran her eyes over the documents again. "This house belongs to you." I nodded. "Yes." Her hands trembled. "No. This is some kind of mistake." I looked at my watch. "The lawyers will be here in 10 minutes. They will officially notify you that you must leave this house within 24 hours. Margaret choked with anger. "Are you kidding?" I sat down at the table calmly and helped myself to my coffee. "No." I took a sip. "You are a guest in my home now." Margaret couldn't breathe. I saw her world crumbling before her eyes. She wanted to destroy me, but instead she destroyed herself. Mark learns the truth. The door flew open. Mark entered the room. He looked pleased with himself. I guessed he didn't even know what was happening yet. "Honey, I thought we could talk." But when he saw his mother's paleness and her hands shaking, he stopped. "What's going on?" Margaret threw the papers down on the table. This, she tricked us." Mark seemed confused. "What are you talking about?" I picked up the papers and handed them to him. "Read them." He took the papers and began to look through them. His face turned white as chalk. No. He looked at me. "Have you been lying to me all this time?" I calmly put down my cup. "No, Mark. I was just defending myself." He choked with rage. But how?" I smiled. "I bought this house before the wedding." I leaned toward him. "Because I knew you would try to get rid of me." Mark looked at his mother. She was silent. He looked back at the papers. "But that means—" I nodded. "That you both have to pack your things." His lips twitched. "Are you kidding?" I stopped smiling. "You have 24 hours. Margaret howled in anger. "No. You can't do this. This is our house." I slowly stood up. "No, Margaret. This is my house." Her hands balled into fists. "You won't do this." I took a step closer and whispered, "I already did it." Margaret looked around, as if searching for something else to do. But she realized there was nothing. She lost. I stood before them, calm, confident. I won, and I enjoyed every second of it. I will never forget that moment. Margaret and Mark stood before me, shocked, devastated. They thought they were throwing me out into the street, but now they were left with nothing. I saw their worlds collapsing right before my eyes. Margaret looked as if boiling water had been poured over her. Her lips were trembling, her fingers were clenched into fists, her eyes were flashing. Mark just stood there, not knowing what to say. He was no longer in control. Neither was his mother. Margaret in despair. Margaret suddenly rushed towards me, grabbed the documents from the desk, and began tearing them into pieces. "It's unfair," she screamed. Her voice broke into hysterics. "You can't do this to us." I just folded my arms calmly. "I can." I took a step closer. "And I already did." Margaret looked at Mark again, as if waiting for him to do something. But he just stood there. He couldn't save her anymore. He couldn't even save himself. I watched the expression in her eyes change, from rage to panic. She finally realized. She's been kicked out. She's been thrown out of her own empire. And it was done by someone she'd always thought was worthless. Mark is terrified. "Listen," Mark finally spoke. His voice was tense, with a hint of desperation. Can we talk about this?" I raised my eyebrows. "Talk about it?" He nodded. "I understand you're angry." I laughed mockingly. "Mark, it doesn't matter anymore." His eyes became pleading. "But you loved me." I nodded slowly. "Once upon a time." Mark looked like he was about to collapse. He didn't believe I could just throw him out. But I had already done it. I walked past him, went to the door and opened it. "You have 24 hours to pack your things and leave." Mark froze. Margaret clutched her head. No. No. This can't be true. I didn't look away. It's true, Margaret. I looked at my watch. And it's already started. Margaret screams hysterically. She couldn't accept reality. She started pacing around the living room, cursing me loudly. You still repent. This is illegal. I'm destroying you, do you hear? I watched her lose control. Margaret was always the one in control. But not this time. This time I was in control. I said nothing. I was just enjoying the spectacle. Mark watched helplessly. He was no longer the confident man I had married. He was broken. He was nothing. The end for them. The beginning for me. The guards arrived within the hour. They had officially confirmed that Margaret and Mark had to leave the estate. I didn't say a word as they left. Margaret looked at me one last time. Her face was twisted with hatred. I'll be back. I just smiled. No, Margaret. You won't be back. She trembled. She had always been feared. But this time she was afraid of me. I closed the door. And finally I breathed in the air of freedom. I was alone in my house. And for the first time in a long time I felt a real victory. I had won. They had lost everything. And now I would start living. Silence. I stood in the middle of a huge house that finally belonged to me. No screaming from Margaret. No manipulation. No constant feeling that I was unwanted in my own life. I took a deep breath and slowly exhaled. I won. The first thing I did after they were evicted. I sat down on my favorite couch in the living room and opened a bottle of expensive wine. I had bought this bottle for my anniversary with Mark, but we had never opened it. She had been waiting for the right moment. And now it was. I slowly poured myself a glass. I raised it up and said quietly, "To freedom." I took my first sip, and for the first time in a long time, I felt real pleasure. What had happened to Mark and Margaret? I hadn't looked for news about them. But the world is small. And very quickly they started telling me how they live. Margaret, from queen to nothing. After she lost her house, her name no longer meant anything. Her friends from high society turned their backs on her. Before, they respected her only for her power and status. And now she had nothing. She settled in a small rented apartment on the outskirts of a city. She once considered me worthless. But now she was worthless. Mark, life after me. My ex-husband also could not recover from this blow. His career went downhill. He looked for a job for a long time, but no one wanted to deal with a person who could not even protect his house. Businessmen know, if you can't protect your life, how will you protect someone else's business? The last time I heard from him, he was a manager at a small company. He was no longer the successful and confident man I had once known. He had lost everything, and it was entirely his fault, an unexpected call. One evening, as I was relaxing at home, my phone vibrated. An unknown number. I hesitated to answer, but something told me it would be interesting. I picked up the phone. "Hi, it's Mark." I didn't answer right away, but my smile only widened. "What do you want?" He sighed, as if he was about to say something important. "I just wanted to know how you were." I laughed. "How am I? Are you serious?" He was silent. I could sense that he was nervous. "I made a mistake," he finally said. I laughed again. "Oh, Mark, you didn't just make a mistake." I said slowly, "You ruined your own life." He exhaled sharply. "But I still love you." I smiled. "And I don't." And without hesitation, I pressed end call. The past no longer had power over me. I was no longer the woman they could humiliate. I was no longer the one they could control. I raised my glass of wine and looked out the window. I had nothing but a bright future ahead of me. I smiled. Here's to a new chapter in my life. And I took a slow, victorious sip. Freedom. I never realized how much I needed it until I got it. The house that had once been filled with cold and toxic was now mine alone. I no longer heard Margaret's contemptuous words. I no longer felt like I had to prove my worth to Mark. I didn't have to please someone who would never be satisfied anyway. I lived for myself. In the first few days after they moved out, I changed everything. The first thing I did was throw away everything that reminded me of them. All the furniture Margaret loved, all the objects Mark chose without my input, everything that had once been a symbol of their power over me. I began to build my own space. Now every corner of this house reflected my personality, my desires. I painted the walls warm colors. I bought new furniture, soft, cozy, stylish. I filled the space with paintings that I always wanted to have. This was no longer Margaret's house. This was my home. What to do next? For a few weeks, I simply enjoyed my freedom. I took my time. I walked, discovered new places in the city. I pursued my hobby, which I had once abandoned. I traveled, discovered new horizons. I lived the way I always wanted to, without control, without fear, without compromise. One morning, when I was sitting on the terrace with a cup of coffee, a thought came to my mind. What next? I no longer wanted to work for someone. I no longer wanted to depend on a man. I wanted complete independence. And then I realized it was time to start my own business, the idea that changed everything. I had always been smart. Margaret didn't see it. Mark didn't appreciate it. But I knew I could achieve something more. I started researching business opportunities. I had enough money to invest in my dream. And one evening, while browsing the market, I found the perfect niche. I decided to start my own luxury interior brand. I knew how to create the perfect space. I understood what makes a home cozy, stylish, alive. And most importantly, I wanted to help other people transform their homes into places where they truly feel happy. This was no longer just about getting revenge on Margaret. This was about me, about my future, about who I wanted to become. A victory that is just beginning. I sat down at my laptop, created my first business plan. I contacted partners who could help me launch the project. I rented an office in the city center. And at that moment, when I signed the lease, I realized I will never live by someone else's rules again. I will never let anyone devalue me again. I will never be that woman who suffers again. I was strong. And this was just the opening chapter of my new story. I raised a glass of champagne in my new office. For a new business. For freedom. For myself. I took a slow sip and smiled. This is just the beginning. I thought I was done with them. I started my new life, started a business, lived the life I had always wanted. But the past never completely disappears. One day it knocked on my door again. An unexpected encounter. I was in my office, working on a new project, when my assistant knocked on the door. You have a visitor. I looked up. Who is it? The assistant looked embarrassed. He says it's personal. His name is Mark. I froze. Blood rushed to my face. I hadn't heard that name in months. I thought he would never come into my life again. But here he was. I sighed and nodded. Okay. Show him around. Mark looked different. When he came in, I barely recognized him. He used to wear expensive suits, with perfect hair, a confident air. Now he looked worn, aged, as if the life had drained from him. His clothes were sloppy, his hair was disheveled, and his eyes were empty. I said nothing. I waited for him to speak first. He sat down across from me, nervously rubbing his fingers together. You look good, he finally said. I nodded. I know. He pursed his lips. Are you mad at me? I raised my eyebrows. Mad? Mark, I don't even think about you anymore. He looked even more devastated. I know it went wrong. I made a mistake. I smiled mockingly. Oh, you didn't just make a mistake. I ran my fingers across the table, savoring every second. You ruined your life. He looked away. I didn't think it would turn out like this. I laughed coldly. Oh, really? You didn't think there would be consequences if you and your mother betrayed me? He seemed even smaller than before. I know I hurt you. I stood up from my chair. You didn't hurt me, Mark. You set me free. I walked around the table and leaned closer to him. And now I want you to leave. His eyes widened. But I wanted to talk. I opened the door. I have nothing more to say to you. Mark froze. He finally understood. I no longer belonged to him. I was no longer his weak wife. I was the woman who had defeated him. He slowly got up and walked to the door. Before leaving, he turned to me. I would like to change everything. I smiled faintly. But you can't. And with those words, I closed the door. I never looked back again. My life was only ahead. Mark was just a past chapter that I had closed forever. I thought that meeting Mark was the last echo of the past. But I was wrong. Because the following week I was waiting for another unexpected meeting. And this time with Margaret. An unexpected visit. One evening I was returning home after a busy day at work. I parked my car outside the house, got out of the car, and suddenly felt a familiar cold gaze. I looked up and saw her. Margaret. She was standing at the gate, wrapped in an old coat. She no longer looked like a queen. Her face was haggard. The dark circles under her eyes testified to sleepless nights. Her hair was no longer perfectly styled as before. She was a shadow of the powerful woman I once knew. I said nothing. I calmly walked past her and unlocked the gate. But as I was about to go inside, she spoke. "Please, give me a few minutes." I turned my head slowly. Margaret never asked. She always ordered. But now she was crushed. I sighed and crossed my arms over my chest. "Say!" Desperate Margaret. She took a step closer. "I know you hate me." I raised my eyebrows mockingly. "Hate? Oh no, Margaret. You don't matter to me anymore." Her lips tightened. I could see how hard it was for her to say each word. "I am in a difficult position." I smiled coldly. "Couldn't you have come up with a less banal lie?" She looked away sharply. "I've lost everything." I didn't say anything. I was enjoying every second of her humiliation. She nervously clenched her fingers. "I don't have any friends anymore. I don't have any money. I can't even rent a decent place." She took a deep breath, and for the first time in her life, said something I never thought I'd hear from her. "I need your help. The final payback." I held my breath for a long time. I looked at the woman who had once ruined my life. I remembered all her humiliations, all her plots, all her words about how I would never be worthy of her son. And now she stood before me, begging for help. I took a step toward her and whispered, "Where did your crown go, Margaret?" Her eyes flashed with anger. "I'm just asking you, be merciful." I laughed. "Merciful? How merciful were you to me?" She pursed her lips. I did it for Mark." I looked at her mockingly. "Oh, really? And where is he now?" She shook her head. "He's gone." I pretended to be surprised. "He left you." She exhaled sharply. "He doesn't want to see me." I could barely contain my pleasure. Even her son turned away from her. I looked at her like a complete failure. She had lost, and now she had come to me. I nodded at the house behind me. "Remember how you kicked me out of here?" She was silent. "How did you mock me? How did you say I would never be part of this family?" I took a step closer. "You're nobody now." She clenched her fists. I could see how much it hurt her to hear that, but I didn't care. I took a deep breath and said the final sentence. "Get out, Margaret." She froze. "What?" I smiled slowly. "You wanted to destroy me, but you destroyed yourself instead." She couldn't believe I was really rejecting her. "You're not like—" "Oh, I'm just like you, Margaret." I looked at my watch. "You have 10 seconds to leave." She was shaking. She knew I was serious, and she had no choice. She turned and slowly walked away. I stood there watching her go. It was a complete and final humiliation. She had lost everything. And worst of all, she had lost her power. This was her defeat. This was my victory. I closed the gate, and the moment I returned to my house, I knew that this chapter of my life was closed forever. I had won. I won. Margaret left. Mark was no longer in my life. I was no longer a woman who could be broken. Now everything was different. I was free. What next? After meeting Margaret, I began to realize how much I had changed. I used to be afraid of conflict. I used to try to please others. I used to let people make fun of me. And now I was a woman in control of my life. I no longer depended on other people's opinions. I no longer adjusted to others. I no longer let anyone define my worth. I decided for myself who I would be, the business that changed everything. My business began to grow rapidly. I wasn't just making money. I was creating something special. My brand became popular among the wealthy. I had influential clients. I went from being Mark's underappreciated wife to a successful businesswoman. I worked on big projects. I spoke at conferences. I gave interviews to famous magazines. Irony. The same people who had previously despised me for my background now wanted to work with me. The luxury I deserve. I bought another house. But not just any house. A luxurious mansion on the coast. Bright, spacious, with huge panoramic windows. I made it the way I always dreamed. No compromises, no other people's decisions. Without Mark, this was my place, my new beginning, a chance encounter with the past. One evening I went to an event for the business elite. I was an honored guest. I looked incredible. A stylish dress, confidence in every movement, a sparkle in my eyes. I was no longer the woman who could be broken. I was enjoying the evening when suddenly I heard a familiar voice. Is that her? I turned my head and saw Mark's wife, a new wife. Mark needed a replacement. She was younger, beautiful, but there was something in her eyes that had once been in mine. She was unhappy. Mark had found another woman to control, a new victim. I took a sip of wine and smiled. I knew that soon she would understand everything I understood. Only she didn't have the power I had. And then I realized I was no longer part of this cycle. I was outside of it. I was above it. I no longer had anything to do with Mark and his world. My rules. My life. I went out onto the terrace, breathed in the fresh air. The lights of the city shone below. The sea murmured softly in the distance. I was no longer the woman who could be used and betrayed. I no longer waited for someone to come and save me. I saved myself. I raised my glass. To freedom. I took a slow sip and smiled. My life was just beginning. My rules. My choice. My victory. A few years passed. My business was thriving. I lived in a luxurious house, traveled the world, and felt stronger than ever. I was no longer a shadow in someone else's life. I no longer let anyone define my worth. I was no longer weak. I was a woman who had won. Life after the storm. I thought that one day it would hurt to remember the past. But now, when I looked back, I felt only relief. Margaret no longer existed in my world. Mark no longer had any power over me. I saw the news about him. He was getting divorced for the second time. The same scenarios, the same story. But this time, I was far from that chaos. I no longer felt regret. I was above it. A man who values me. Finally, I met someone special. A man who didn't try to control me. Who didn't compare me to his mother's ideals. Who saw me as a strong woman, not an addition to his life. He wasn't Mark. He was better. And the difference between them was obvious. Mark wanted ownership. This man wanted a partnership. Mark wanted control. This man wanted love. I was no longer a woman to be crushed. I was a woman who knew what she was worth. The final victory. One day, I sat on the terrace of my house, watching the sunset, and realized I won. Not because they lost everything. Not because their lives were falling apart. But because I no longer thought about them. I was no longer part of their world. I had created my own world. A world where I was loved, respected, and valued. A world where I was happy. I raised my glass of wine and said quietly, to real life, and took a last sip.